Hi, my name is Jim and I was retired. In my DIY retirement, I pay attention to inflation, which can be a cruel tax for those of us who can't ask for a pay raise. Now, I will show you the latest Fed actions and inflation readings from last week, and I'll follow up my last video on the Boldin Planner with an example of how I use this information to plug in the Boldin inflation factors that I use in my DIY retirement. Stay tuned. Hey, Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to all of you out there. Before I go any further, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and share this channel if you like entertaining ideas from a DIY retiree. So let's begin with a little background. I closely follow the Fed's group of policymakers, the Federal Open Market Committee, or FOMC, to understand inflation and interest rates in my DIY retirement planning. Now, here's a chart that I shared last week with my X feed. You can follow me there at I Was Retired. Now, it highlights this yellow line, which represents the personal consumption expenditures, or PCE index, which is the Fed's preferred measure of inflation. In November, it hit 2.4%, up from October. Now, the chart also shows this green line, which is the upper range of the federal funds rate. That's the policy rate that the FOMC sets. And last week, the FOMC lowered it a quarter point to 4.5%. Now, ideally, the Fed uses the green line to influence the yellow line, but that hasn't been so easy since 2020. Now, the FOMC tries to guide us about their path of monetary policy through the summary of economic projections, which are issued 4 times a year. A year ago, in the December 2023 meeting, the FOMC had a median projection for the policy rate at the end of 2024 and said it was going to be 4.6%. And in March, that's what they reiterated, 4.6 for the year-end 2024 policy rate. But in June, they jumped it up to 5.1%. I think they were concerned that inflation might return, so they upped it. But then in September, it went down to 4.4% again. And in December, it was 4.4% as the median policy rate. Now, that 4.4% is exactly where the Fed funds is trading today. So, except for that June median estimate, the market should have expected a rate of about 4.5, 4.4%. So, why was the market reacting so negatively to what's described as a hawkish cut last week? Well, the secret is the dot plot, which includes a projection from each participant in the FOMC meeting. And I've done a video about this before. These dots in the latest SEP were telling us a story of greater uncertainty around the table, and the path for the next few years is going to be much slower on bringing rates down as inflation comes down. So it was a little slower than the market expected. Here's the dot plot from December. And note that while the median policy rate remains at 4.4%, 4 policymakers, including Beth Hammack, the new Cleveland Fed president, who dissented as a voting member this December meeting, believe the rate should be higher. Who are the other 3? We don't know. Do they vote in 2025? In 2025, the median projection is now year-end to be at 3.9%, which would only take 2 quarter-point cuts to get to there. But again, opinions vary. 1 suggests no cuts and 3 advocate only 1 cut. By 2026, the median forecast implies 2 more cuts to 3.4%, though again, the projections range widely. There's some there that suggest the rate should be as low as 2.5% by the end of 2026. And you can see, though, that there are hawks at the top that think no additional cuts need to be made. Looking ahead to 2027, the median projection shows one more rate cut to 3.1%. But again, opinions vary. But now look at the last column there, and that's longer run forecast of a median 3.0%, which raises questions about the long-standing 2% inflation target. This graphic compares the December 2024 longer run estimate with the December SEP forecast from the past 3 years. Now, this year's median rate is substantially higher at 3.0% compared to the 2.5 it's been for the last 3 years. Now, again, it used to be that the longer run was about 2.5% to keep the target inflation rate at about 2%. And in fact, if you look at the longer run projections from this year, it has risen from 2.6 in March to 2.8 in June to 2.9 in September and now 3.0 in December. Something is broken. With this much uncertainty about the longer run inflation, what should I use in my DIY retirement plans? I'm going to show you some screen grabs from my Boldin Planner to show you the optimistic and pessimistic numbers that I put in to get the average assumptions for inflation. Now, in the main overview page, you can either use this toolbar that I described last week and that icon there on the right to get to this and go down to edit rate assumptions. Or you can go to the left here and go down to rate assumptions there. When I began using Boldin, I defaulted to a 3% average inflation factor, and I thought I was being conservative. I set the optimistic at 2 and the pessimistic at 4, and that's how that simple math works. Now you get to that screen to edit the rate assumptions with this little down arrow here, and that brings up the fields where you change the numbers. In fact, my 3% that I've been using is a little bit more conservative than the general inflation rate that Boldin uses as its default. But given the latest inflation numbers over the next few years, is this the right assumption to still use? Then I thought about it and I decided to download the annual percentage changes in the Consumer Price Index for urban workers, CPI-U, from Fred, the database from the St. Louis Fed. And then I used this formula to find the average for each decade. And to make it easier to graph, I put all those numbers in this smaller table on the right. And that gave me a bar chart of average inflation rates by decade from the 1950s to the present. The last two bars show the first 3 years of the current decade and the year to date for 2024. And there's just too much uncertainty about what number to use for the 2020s average inflation. I could use like the 1970s as the pessimistic and the 1910s as the optimistic value. Averaging those two numbers would suggest an average of 4.5%. Is that the right number to use? I decided to ask Siri Apple Intelligence to show me a formula in numbers that would average the 3 largest values in the column and the 3 lowest in the column. And then I used that formula to give me a new optimistic value of 2.1% and a new pessimistic value of 5.2%, as shown in the formula text. Now, going back to the rate assumption page, I entered those new values in the optimistic and pessimistic fields, and that gives me a new average of 3.65%. But note, when you do that, my higher inflation assumption changes the success in my baseline plan from 99% to 90%. And if you're going to change your perspective in the baseline, make sure you change the numbers in each of your scenarios. Now, when I applied the inflation assumptions to my Roth conversion scenario, the chance of success goes back to 99%. Now, I'll put several links below to useful pages on Boldin, as well as some pages elsewhere on how to think about inflation. Let me know what inflation assumptions you're using in your DIY retirement plan. I will conclude with my standard warning. I have no initials after my name, so take these as entertaining ideas from one educated consumer to another. Always do your own due diligence and seek out a professional if you need one.